2019 was a year across the Asia-Pacific region of repression, but also of resistance. We saw this most clearly with the two largest countries of the region, China and India. In Hong Kong, we saw the Chinese authorities take aim at the key freedoms which were guaranteed in the 1997 handover agreement, triggering protests on an unprecedented scale that brought millions out onto the streets, but also led to heavy-handed measures, including the use of excessive and unnecessary force through repeated volleys of tear gas, rubber bullets, and other forms. In India, the bright flames of protests were seen across the country towards the end of last year, after the passing of the Citizen Amendment Act, which decided on discriminatory grounds who could or could not become an Indian citizen, particularly singling out Muslims for discrimination. That came after also assaults on nominally autonomous parts of both countries. The Indian state of Jammu and Kashmir was subject to a lockdown, which continues to some extent to this day, locking out all communications for more than 8 million people in what was then, up to that point, the country's only Muslim majority state. In Xinjiang province in China, the Chinese authorities proceeded with their plans of indoctrination, detention, and other forms of discrimination and humiliation against Turkic Muslims, particularly the Uyghurs. Across South Asia and Southeast Asia, a recurrent theme was an assault on key freedoms: the freedom of expression, freedom of peaceful assembly, and the freedom of association.
This is a review of the human rights situation in Sri Lanka for the year 2019. So from 1st of January to the 31st. Although, as you may know, there are developments since, but particularly this press conference is on the annual report. So our top lines are that the transitional justice commitments that the government entered to and committed to its own people in 2015 have not been realized in full. So we have key advances like land return to civilian owners, the OMP is operational, the Office on Reparations, but very limited steps on accountability for human rights violations, particularly on serious human rights violations. There were freedom of expression and freedom of religious belief restrictions in the aftermath of the April bombings, and particularly we saw the Muslim community targeted. So that's just an overview. So by the end of the year, we still didn't see the notorious Prevention of Terrorism Act repealed, which is a commitment that the government made. They said that they would review, repeal it, and replace it with legislation that lives up to international human rights standards. So we unfortunately didn't see that commitment be realized by the end of the year. We also didn't see the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which the government promised, come into fruition. Neither did we see the special court. So on OMP, which was, as I mentioned, one of the key advances we saw that the carbon dating process of the second mass grave go on. They also opened offices in Mathura, Jaffna, and Mana. By the end of the year, we saw one of the recommendations the OMP made in its interim report the previous year that was adopted by the outgoing cabinet. So there was one interim recommendation that was adopted. Then there were hurried indictments filed by the Attorney General just before the elections at the end of the year. But even in those, especially command responsibility was something we didn't see in those cases as well. So these include the Valikada prison massacre from 2012 and Prageet's abduction in 2010. In the Trinco Fire case, which I'm sure some of you all are aware of, there was an acquittal. And the Attorney General decided to recommence investigations, which is a welcome sign. The OHCHR investigation, which named key alleged perpetrators, we saw by the end of the year some of them who were first already holding key positions be promoted. For example, this includes Shabendra Silva, who was appointed the Army Commander by the end of the year last year. We also saw promotions for people who are charged with human rights violations, for example, in the Navy abductions case in the Lebanon youth. And on the Viswamadu case, you might recall that the Court of Appeal acquitted the 4 soldiers who were charged with the crime, where a woman was gang raped by 4 soldiers. So after the Easter attacks, we also saw that there were arbitrary arrests and detentions, and this was also facilitated by both the PTA and the emergency regulations. The PTA, which the government itself said would repeal and replace, and because of the emergency regulations, where there were restrictions on the face veil for Muslim women and freedom of religious belief on publications and things like that, because of that, there were restrictions on rights. We also saw people targeted, for example, writers like Shaktika. And by the end of the year, we were happy to see that the Supreme Court of Sri Lanka did issue a temporary reprieve on the death penalty, where the previous president had signed the death warrants of 4 prisoners.